If you could tell me a bit about Ballybuckle Bow and its inhabitants, its curious inhabitants, for people who might not have read it yet.
Well, Ballybuckle Bow is essentially a figment of my imagination. It's a small village in the north of Ireland, in north of County Down. It's amazing how many of my friends over there keep trying to find where it is, because I refer to some real geographic places, like, for example, the Six Road Ends. And they say, well, if it's that far from the Six Road Ends, it must be Hollywood. And I say, no, it's not, it's Ballybuckle Bow. Well, now, on the south shore of Belfast Lough, you've described sand dunes. There aren't any. The only place with a sandy beach is Helen's Bay, so it must be Helen's Bay. It's not. It's some place I made up, as are the people in it. The prime characters in it are two physicians. One is a young man straight out of medical school, 24, innocent, wet behind the ears, and the other is a foul-mouthed, semi-alcoholic, ex-pugilist, 56-year-old single-handed general practitioner. They're the driving central characters. The best supporting actresses are Mrs. Kincaid, the housekeeper from County Cork, and she's the Earth Mother type. And the young doctor, Barry Laverty, the love of his life is a woman called Patricia Spence. And in 1964, she's something really different. She's actually a civil engineering student. And you have to remember in 1964 in Ireland, women were secretaries or nurses. So she's a bit ahead of her time. The rest of the place is populated by as many eccentrics as you can squeeze onto the page, and an alcoholic Labrador dog and a demoniacally possessed white cat.
So you say the inhabitants and the town are a figment of your imagination, but I think people always want to know if there's some reality to that. Are these characters that you knew in your youth?
I think what I have to say, I'm asked this question all the time, and I actually have a stock answer. I'm going to ask you a question. Can you describe for me a colour that does not exist in the visible spectrum?
Nope, I can't.
So when I come to create characters, I have to use recognisable behaviours. Unless I'm writing science fiction. And of course I steal behaviours from people I've known in the past. I don't think there's a writer who doesn't.
Now, you've lived away from where you grew up in Northern Ireland for a long time.
37 years.
Yeah. And I often wonder when writers live away and then go back to more or less to their home as the environment for their stories. Do you remember everything, or do you actually have to go back and do research?
For the last 15 years, I've been back in Ireland twice a year. In the place where I grew up. And I mean, we all remember the place we grew up in. What I have to remember is that the Ireland I'm in now, in 2008, is not the Ireland I was in 1964. It's much more densely populated, the traffic is appalling, the cost is astronomical, and my God, a pint of Guinness is $6.
You sound to me like you're a Northern Irishman, but has living away affected the way you speak?
Tiny little things only. I would say tomato in Ireland. People wouldn't understand me. I have to say tomato here. I would say estrogen in Ireland, estrogen here. Other than that, no, it really hasn't. And with due respect to Canada, there are very few weird expressions in Canada speak. Like, for example, your man there has a queer soft hand under a duck, which means he's very good at something, or very gentle. So that idiom stayed with me all my life.
Yeah, that was actually one of the things I was going to ask you about, because the expressions are so lovely and so evocative. Do you have any favourite?
Another one I like is "you wouldn't come within a bagel's guile of it."
And what does that mean?
A bagel is the Ulster pronunciation of beagle, which is a dog. Okay, it's gowl, would probably be called a howl in this country. A beagle is a dog which can be heard over a great distance, and so if you wouldn't come within a bagel's guile of it, you'd be miles off target. If you were so far away you couldn't hear the dog. That's what it means.
Do people ask you about that a lot, your North American readers?
Yes, they do. However, my editor at Forge is a wonderful woman, Natalia Ponte, and on the first book in the series she said, you got to put a glossary in the back of that boy. So anybody who's stuck can always turn to the back of the book.
You were a doctor, and you chose to make your main characters doctors, or two of them. Mm-hmm. What about your profession made you want to write about that in the fictional world?
Well, actually, it didn't initially, and I resisted it. My first 3 books, one was a collection of short stories, and the next 2 were one after another about the same characters. They were techno-thrillers about the provisional IRA, because I said deliberately I did not want to be regarded as a retired doctor who could only write about doctors. Purely by chance, I had been writing a humour column once a month for a medical humour magazine, in which Dr. O'Reilly started to appear. And being idle, I asked my editor, with my Canadian publisher, if they would consider taking my 10 years' worth of stories about these characters, stick them between covers and make me some money. And they said, no, go away and write us a novel about the characters. And they did. And, I mean, just once in a while all the planets do line up in a row. And Natalia Ponte from Forge got her hands on a copy of the book and said, I like this. Will you switch publishers? And I said, yes. And I'm locked into writing about doctors now.
You're writing about doctors in the 1960s, and of course medical practice has changed tremendously. Do you have to think back to your own youth?
I'm a complete pack rat. I kept every single textbook I had when I was a medical student, and that's very helpful because you can't Google how tuberculosis was treated in 1964. You can Google how it's treated today. My textbooks tell me. And actually there was a book called Not as a Stranger. I can't remember the author, but it was about a doctor, training as a doctor. And the old country doctor says to the young fella, what is a doctor? A doctor is a man who remembers things. When you think about it, that is a lot of what doctors do. And I've been blessed with a good memory. I can pretty well remember a lot of how we treated people back then.
Tell us a bit about An Irish Country Christmas, which I know is going to be published here soon.
Yes, it's coming out for the Christmas season this year. An Irish Country Christmas just basically follows on the first one, An Irish Country Doctor. And that's when the young man arrives in the practice. An Irish country village picks up the morning after a hell of a party to say goodbye to one of the villagers. An Irish Country Christmas moves the thing forward to 2 weeks before Christmas Day. And during that time, a new doctor appears in town, and he's a charlatan, and O'Reilly and Laverty have to sort him out. Patricia has won her scholarship to Cambridge. She's in Cambridge. She's promised to come home for Christmas, but she keeps making excuses not to come home, and Barry's all concerned she's got another fellow in Cambridge. And, of course, being Christmas in Ireland, there are opportunities for the Marquess of Ballybucklebow to have an open house, and I'm sure you can imagine shenanigans occur there. Throughout the book, there's the recurrent motif of various patients with various diseases. And all the ends, I hope, get tied together quite tidily on Christmas Day, with just enough left hanging in the air to get another book going.
What's next for you and these characters?
Well, what's next is there'll be a fourth in the series called An Irish Country Courtship, because at the end of Christmas, Barry and Patricia are not altogether sure where they're going, and old O'Reilly, who's a 56-year-old widower, readers won't know this, but in the first book it's explained that he was in the Royal Navy in the Second World War on a battleship called Warspite. And while he was at sea, the girl he'd been in love with was killed because the Luftwaffe did actually bomb Belfast in 1941, and he's been carrying a torch for years. But a woman who's now a sister, and I have to explain that to American readers, this is not religious orders. It goes back to the days when nurses were nuns. But whereas you would have a head nurse in America, the nurse in charge of a ward in Ireland is called sister. That's her title. She's not a sister. She was a student nurse when he was a medical student, and she's come back into his life. So the Irish Country Courtship's going to follow those two. But concurrently, I've been asked to write a 45,000-word novella set at Christmas. And I wanted a break from the doctors, and I'm very fond of one of my characters, Mrs. Kincaid, the housekeeper. There's a wonderful scene in a book called The Wind in the Willows, where Rat and Mole have to go to the door because the dormice are singing carols. Just before the end of Christmas, the kids from the village are singing carols on the doorstep. Mrs. Kincaid has them in to give them hot juice and mince pies, and one of them says, "Tell us a story, Mrs. Kincaid." And she tells them a ghost story, a Christmas ghost story about the banshee and the doveshee and the thevshee and the ghosts, and it's working quite well. I've got the first draft written. My editor's being nice to me about it, which is always good.
You mentioned that you're very fond of Mrs. Kincaid, and I think writers often have characters that they're particularly fond of. Are there others?
Oh, it's O'Reilly. I've lived with O'Reilly for 20 years now. When I wrote the columns, there's certain technical things in writing. Writing humour, it's a lot easier to write if you cast yourself as a character, because then you can make any kind of aside without indulging in authorial intrusion. So when I originally wrote the columns, I described myself as the young doctor character, and that allowed me to make observations in print. And I really got to know O'Reilly terribly well over those 10 years.
All right, well, I think we're done. Thank you very much.
Thank you.